I was 72 when I found out my husband had another family. 72. 40 years of marriage, 3 grown children, and a lifetime of memories that suddenly felt like ashes in my hands. It began on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind where the clock ticks too loud and the kettle whistles a little too long. I was sitting by the window, knitting a blanket for my granddaughter, when my husband's phone rang. He had gone out to buy bread, and the screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize, Leela. At first, I didn't think much of it. We're old, after all. People call from the pharmacy, the bank, even wrong numbers. But when the phone rang again, something in me hesitated. I picked it up. My hands trembled, not because I meant to snoop, but because something in my gut whispered that this wasn't just a mistake. "Hello?" I said softly. A young woman's voice answered, warm and casual. "Oh, hi, Dad. I just wanted to remind you that it's Mom's appointment today. Don't forget." The room froze around me. My throat went dry. My heart, old and tired, began to pound like it hadn't in years. I sat there, gripping the phone, listening to the echo of her words. Dad. Mom's appointment. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The girl on the line must have thought the signal dropped because she said, "Dad? Are you there?" Then hung up. When my husband Richard came home 10 minutes later, the world had already changed for me. He smiled like nothing had happened, placed the bread on the table, and kissed my forehead. That simple act, so familiar, so routine, felt like an insult now. I forced a smile, but inside, something cracked. I didn't say anything that day. I watched him eat dinner, listened to him talk about how the price of gas had gone up again, how his knees were hurting from the cold. I nodded, as though the foundation of our life wasn't crumbling beneath my feet. But that night, as he snored beside me, I stared at the ceiling and whispered into the dark, "Who are you really, Richard?" For days, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe that girl was confused. Maybe she called the wrong number. But the word Dad lingered like a splinter in my mind. A week later, when Richard said he had to visit a friend out of town, I followed him. I know how that sounds, sneaky, desperate. But after 40 years of loving a man, you earn the right to chase the truth. I called a taxi, wrapped my shawl around me, and told the driver to follow his car. He drove about 30 minutes outside the city, down roads I didn't recognize, until we reached a quiet neighborhood filled with small, pastel-colored houses. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Richard parked in front of a white house with blue shutters. And then, I saw her. A woman, maybe in her late 40s, opened the door. She was holding a toddler on her hip. She smiled when she saw him. Not a polite smile, a familiar one. The kind I used to give him when he came home from work. He kissed her cheek, took the child in his arms, and laughed. I don't remember breathing. I don't even remember how I didn't collapse right there. I sat in that taxi, frozen, watching as the man I'd built my entire life around stepped inside that house like he belonged there. The driver asked softly, "Ma'am, are you all right?" I couldn't answer. I just said, "Take me home." That ride back was the longest of my life. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept staring out the window, replaying every year of our marriage in my head. The anniversary dinners, the hospital visits, the nights we cried together when his brother died, the Christmases with the grandchildren. Was it all a lie? When I reached home, I went straight to our bedroom. His scent was still on the pillow. His shirts were neatly folded in the wardrobe. I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "How long, Richard? How long have you been living 2 lives?" That night, he returned as though nothing had happened. He even brought me flowers, yellow tulips, my favorite. He smiled and said, "I saw these and thought of you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw them at his face. But I didn't. I simply said, "Thank you." Because now I needed time. I needed to understand why. Over the next few days, I began to look. Old receipts, strange phone numbers, small gaps in his stories. Everything I had ignored for decades suddenly made sense. The business trips that were too long. The birthdays he missed by mistake. The late-night calls where he stepped outside. One night, when he went to shower, I opened his old briefcase. Tucked inside, between some faded papers, was a photograph. A family portrait. Him, that same woman, the girl who had called, grown up now, and 2 young children. My husband stood there in the middle, his arm around them, smiling like the happiest man alive. The room spun. I pressed the photo to my chest and sobbed like I hadn't in years. I thought of our wedding day, the vows we made before God and family, the promises, the trust. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't even sleep. I just stared at the window until dawn broke, wondering how you spend 40 years with someone and still don't know who they truly are. The next morning, he found me sitting in the kitchen. He smiled, poured himself coffee, and asked, "Did you sleep well?" I looked up at him, my eyes swollen, my heart broken, and whispered, "Who is Lila?" He froze. The cup stopped halfway to his lips, his face drained of color. And in that silence, I knew. He didn't speak for a long moment. The clock ticked on the wall, loud enough to slice through the silence. His hand trembled slightly as he set the cup down. Then, with a calmness that chilled me, he said, "Where did you hear that name?" I kept my eyes on him. "She called. She thought I was you. She said, 'Dad, don't forget Mom's appointment.'" His lips parted, but no words came out. His eyes darted to the window, to the floor, anywhere but me. After 40 years, I knew every gesture of his body. I could tell when he was lying, when he was nervous, when he was pretending to care. And right now, he was terrified. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging like a man defeated. "You weren't supposed to find out," he whispered. I felt my stomach twist. "Find out what, Richard? That you've been living a lie? That you've got another wife? Another family?" My voice cracked halfway through, the fury colliding with heartbreak. He rubbed his temples, avoiding my gaze. "It's complicated," he murmured. "Complicated?" I laughed, a sound that didn't feel like mine. "Complicated is forgetting our anniversary. This is betrayal." He didn't answer. He just sat there staring at the wall, as if waiting for me to stop. But I couldn't stop. Years of quiet patience, of compromise, of standing beside him through every storm, all of it poured out like poison. "How long, Richard?" I demanded. "How long have you been lying to me?" He hesitated, then said quietly, "Almost 30 years." The air left my lungs. 30 years. That meant he'd started seeing her just 10 years into our marriage, when our youngest son was still in diapers. My hands clenched around the edge of the table. "You've been living 2 lives for 30 years?" He nodded once, eyes wet but unashamed. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. "It started as a mistake. I was lonely. You were sick then, remember? You were in and out of the hospital, and I didn't know how to handle it." My voice trembled. "So while I was fighting to stay alive, you were out building another family?" He winced. "Please don't say it like that. It wasn't planned. I tried to end it, but then Lila got pregnant, and I couldn't abandon her." "Abandon her?" I shouted, rising from my chair. "You abandoned me! You abandoned us!" Tears blurred my vision. I wanted to break every plate in that kitchen, to erase every memory that tied me to him. But instead, I just stood there, shaking, watching the man I'd loved all my life shrink into a stranger. He reached out as if to comfort me. "I took care of both families," he said. "I made sure you never lacked anything. I never stopped loving you, Margaret." "Love?" I spat the word like it burned my tongue. "You call this love? Hiding another woman, another daughter from me for 30 years? You watched me cook for you, wash your clothes, hold your hand when your mother died, and all that time you were spending nights in another home, pretending to be someone else's husband." He flinched, and for a moment I saw something raw in his face. Guilt, maybe even shame. But it wasn't enough, not for what he'd done. "Does she know about me?" I asked, my voice quieter now. He hesitated. "She knows that I was married. But she doesn't know your name. I told her it was over between us years ago." I laughed again, bitterly. "And yet here you are, still living under my roof, eating my food, kissing me goodnight. You disgust me." I left the kitchen before I could collapse. I locked myself in our bedroom and cried until I had no tears left. Every corner of that house screamed of him. Our wedding photo on the dresser, the worn armchair where he read his newspaper, the sweater I had knitted for him last winter. That night, I couldn't bear to sleep beside him. I made up a bed in the guest room and stared at the ceiling, the same question replaying over and over in my head. Who am I if my life has been a lie? The next morning, I went through his things, every drawer, every box. I found more photos, birthday parties, vacations, children who shared his smile. He'd been with them every year while telling me he was on business trips. There were cards addressed to Dad, drawings from his other kids, even a key to that blue-shuttered house. I sat on the floor, surrounded by proof of his double life. 40 years of devotion reduced to paper lies. When he came looking for me, I didn't hide what I was doing. I wanted him to see. I wanted him to watch his secrets burn. I threw the pictures on the floor and said, "Here, take your real family. Go live with them. You've done enough damage here." He knelt down, his voice trembling. "Please, Margaret, listen to me. I can't leave you. You're my wife." "Wife?" I whispered. You made that word meaningless. I turned away, but he grabbed my arm. "You don't understand. It's not what you think anymore. Lila's sick. That's why I've been spending more time there. She might not make it." For a brief moment, I froze. A flicker of pity crossed my heart, but then anger swallowed it whole. "So you want me to feel sorry for your mistress now?" He shook his head. "I'm just trying to be honest." "Honest?" I said, my voice breaking. "Honesty would have been 30 years ago, when you came home from her bed and kissed me goodnight." He looked away, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. But I had no sympathy left. That night, I packed his suitcase. Every shirt, every sock, every tie. I placed it by the door. "Leave," I said. "Go take care of your other family. You owe them more than you ever owed me." He stood there for a long moment, his face pale, his eyes glistening with regret. "You'll always be the love of my life," he said quietly. I didn't reply. I just shut the door behind him. When I heard his car drive away, I sank to the floor. The house was silent, too silent. For the first time in 40 years, I was truly alone. But even then, I didn't know that this story wasn't over. not yet. Because 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. One that would change everything I thought I knew about betrayal and about love. The envelope was thick, the kind that makes a dull thud on the table when it lands. My name was written in careful loops, Margaret Whitlow, and there was no return address, only a faint smudge where the sender might have wiped a trembling thumb. I stood there in the quiet, letting the kettle hiss to itself while the tea went bitter, and stared at that envelope like it could bite me. I opened it with the butter knife. Inside was a letter written on lined paper torn from a notebook, and a smaller, older envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with a strip of brittle tape. The first letter was new. The handwriting was steady, graceful. It read, "Mrs. Whitlow, you don't know me, but I know you. I am sorry to come to you like this. I have been ill, and I need your help. I know what Richard has told you, and I know what he hasn't. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am asking for truth. Please come to the house with the blue shutters. I promise I will explain everything. Bring the old envelope. It belongs to you. Lila." I read it twice. I looked down at the second envelope, the old one. Across the front, in a faded hand, was written, "To be opened by Margaret if I cannot speak." There was no signature. My first impulse was to burn both letters and never say her name again. But there is a cruel curiosity that comes with age, the kind that lingers after you've seen too much, and yet you still want to see the last corner of the room before you die. I put on my coat. The house with the blue shutters was quieter than the first time. No laughter, no cars. The grass in the front yard had turned pale and thirsty. I stood at the gate and felt that old dizziness, 40 years of marriage tightening like a ribbon around my throat. I told myself I was just delivering a message, then go home, lock the door, and never think of them again. A young boy with a mop of dark hair opened the door. He looked about 9, perhaps 10, with a brave chin that belonged to no one but himself. His eyes, those eyes, were Richard's, stubborn and soft at once. "Is your mother home?" I asked. He blinked, wary, then stepped back. "She's sleeping," he said, "but you can come in. Are you Grandma?" The question struck me like a thrown stone. I couldn't move for a second. Then I whispered, "No, darling, I'm a friend." He nodded as if he'd expected something like that. Children are detectives. They read sorrow the way we read weather. He led me down a narrow hall that smelled like lemon oil and something sterile beneath it, like a hospital. A little girl sat on the floor coloring, her socks mismatched, her tongue pressed to her lip in concentration. "Hi," she chirped without looking up. "We're making a surprise for Mom." I said hello, barely breathing. The boy pointed toward a half-open door. "She's in there. She doesn't always wake up, but she said you would come." I approached the doorway, each step a courtroom, each breath a witness. Lila lay propped on pillows, her face ashen, her hair wrapped in a scarf patterned with tiny flowers. Her eyes opened slowly and rested on me, and in them there was a weariness I recognized as the final station of grief. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. I stood with my coat still on, clutching the old envelope to my chest. "You wrote to me." "Yes." Her voice was papery and dry. "Close the door, please." I did, carefully. My hands weren't steady. I went to the foot of the bed, not near enough to touch. She studied me with a heartbroken gentleness that took me by surprise. No malice, only the quiet of someone who has run out of time for anger. "I didn't know about you at the beginning," she said. "I swear. I was 23. He told me he was separated. He told me there were misunderstandings. By the time I knew, I was already in love. Foolish, I know." "You knew by the time you had a daughter," I said. My voice came out colder than I intended. She nodded. Yes, and I made a selfish choice. I kept him. I thought I could make a life that wouldn't hurt you. I thought if I lived quietly, if I never touched your world, perhaps you would never bleed from mine. You called him Dad, I said, thinking of the voice on the phone, bright and casual. My daughter is named Lily, she said, almost smiling. She's 28. She lives 3 cities away. She's good. Better than I deserve. Why call me now? The question scraped my throat. Why do this to me now? Because I am dying, she said simply. No drama, only the exhausted truth. And because there are letters that must be read. Not mine, his. I glanced at the envelope in my hands. This? It's addressed to me. Not by me, she said. By the woman who loved you first. The room tilted. What woman? Your sister. I said no too quickly. The word bounced off the walls and landed on the quilt like a lie abandoned. I don't have a sister, I said. I had a twin who died the day we were born. My mother told me, your mother told you a story to protect you, Lila said, her eyes unblinking. The church kept a record. I found it because I was looking for a way to save my life when I was 28 and foolish and pregnant with a married man's child. I went to the charity office to ask for help. Your maiden name was on an old ledger in a box. I recognized it because Richard said it once when he drank too much. The name matched the town you came from. The ledger recorded twins relinquished to the convent for care. One died, one lived. One was adopted by your parents. The other was placed in a different home. Her name was Rose. I tried to laugh. The sound fractured as it left me. This is madness. Open the envelope, she said. My fingers worked clumsily at the tape. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed like the belly of an old petal. The handwriting was neat in the way of women raised on careful penmanship. I recognized the first few curves before I could deny it. It was my mother's. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, I am gone, and there is something I never told you because I could never find the courage. You were born with a twin, and I wanted both of you. But your father was poor and ill, and the midwife said one of you wouldn't make it through the week. They told us to choose which baby to bring home. I chose you, not because I loved you more, but because you were smaller. I thought your sister, stronger, would survive with the nuns. I was wrong to leave her, and I have tried to find her over the years. I tracked her once to a home on Hollow Street, but they told me she ran away at 15. I have searched, but time has a cruel habit of erasing the chalk we write with. If you ever find her, tell her I loved her every day. Mother. The words blurred until they were only water. I pressed the paper to my face, and my breath smudged the ghosts of the ink. I didn't hear the little girl come to the doorway. I didn't hear the boy whisper something like, "Is Grandma crying?" All I heard was my mother's apology ringing over 47 years of silence. Lila watched me with an empathy that bled through her sickness. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you. But I thought, maybe, if you understood how many secrets are older than any of us." "What does this have to do with Richard?" I asked, not wiping my tears, not caring that they streaked into my mouth like salt. She coughed, the kind of cough that scrapes a person from the inside. When she caught her breath, she said, "He met Rose before he met you." I shook my head. No. In his 20s, Mila said softly. Years before he married you, he fell in love with a woman named Rose. She disappeared. He thought she had betrayed him. He never told you because he thought you would hate him for the pieces of his life that didn't belong to you. He kept the letters she wrote. They're in the box beneath this bed. She was your sister. I staggered backward and sat on the edge of the chair because the world had changed shape and I needed something to anchor me. He loved my sister, I said, and the word sister felt like a foreign coin in my mouth, heavy and cold. He married me. He didn't know, Mila said. Not at first. Then one day he saw a photograph on your parents' mantel. He recognized her. He convinced himself it couldn't be the same woman. He decided life would be kinder if he never asked the question. Men are cowards like that. I tasted iron where I'd bitten my lip. You expect me to believe that my husband loved my twin, lost her, and then married me without telling me a word? I expect you to believe that people choose survival over truth more often than we like to admit, she said. And I expect you to know that he's been running from that photograph for 40 years. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it belonged to someone else. Lila reached for the box beneath her bed with fingers that shook and brought it to me. Inside were bundled letters tied with string, their corners worn by time. On top was a creased photo of a young woman with my face but not my eyes, her smile a little crooked, her hair a little wilder. I held the picture like a relic. Where is she? I whispered. Where is Rose? Lila looked past me, to the doorway where her children watched with quiet faces, and then back to me with a sorrow that cut deeper than any confession. That, she said, is the second truth. I waited. The house hummed with the small sounds of living, pencils scratching, a clock ticking, a child's soft hum. But in the bed before me, a woman gathered what little time she had left and chose her next words the way a surgeon chooses a blade. She died, Lila said, 29 years ago, in a hospital 3 towns east, complications from a hemorrhage. She used a different name by then. No one connected the records. Richard found out 2 years later. He never told you. He said it would ruin the rest of your lives. My throat closed. A sound came out of me that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a denial. I don't remember standing, but I was on my feet, swaying, holding my mother's letter in one hand and the photo of a ghost in the other. I don't know what to do with this, I said. I don't know how to fit my life around it. Lila's eyes shone. Take the letters, and take my children into your prayers if nothing else. And if you can find a piece of mercy for the man who broke you, keep it with the others. It won't excuse him, nothing will. But some truths refuse to be carried alone. The boy, brave chin, soft eyes, stepped forward and pressed a paper flower into my palm. We made this for Mom, he said, then glanced up at me as if asking permission to believe I might belong to them in some way that didn't have a name yet. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. I slipped the paper flower into my coat pocket like a fragile talisman. When I got home, the late sun was cooling itself against the stove of the horizon, and the house looked like a memory someone had left out in the rain. I placed the box of letters on the kitchen table. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat until the windows darkened and the glass reflected a woman I barely recognized. I opened the first letter and read a younger life in a stranger's script. I read until my eyes burned and the words bled into one another. I read until the clock forgot its own hands. and then I heard the key in the door. "Margaret?" His voice was cautious, like a man stepping into a room that might judge him. He walked into the kitchen and stopped when he saw the box, the letters, the photograph of the woman with my face. I raised the picture and held it where the last thread of daylight could stitch through her smile. "Tell me about Rose," I said. His knees went weak. He reached for a chair and missed. In that moment, I understood the third truth, the one Lila hadn't said, the one leaking out of his eyes like a confession too heavy to hold. He had been grieving her for 40 years. And he had been grieving me, too, without daring to admit either. But there was still one more secret, one I hadn't seen until he opened his mouth to speak and called me by a name he had never used for me before. "Rose," he breathed, his face pale as chalk. "You found her name." He sank into the chair across from me, his eyes locked on the photograph in my trembling hands. He looked 20 years older in that moment, as though the weight of every buried memory had suddenly climbed back onto his shoulders. "I didn't mean for you to find out this way," he whispered. "Not after everything that's already happened." My voice was a ghost of itself. "You called me Rose just now." His lips quivered. "Because for a second, when I saw that picture again, I thought..." He swallowed hard. "You looked exactly like her. I thought I was seeing her again." I stared at him, my heart breaking all over again. "So it's true then. You knew her. You loved her." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yes. I loved her before I even knew you existed." The words hung in the air like smoke, choking everything between us. He rubbed his face with shaking hands. "It was 1963. I was 21, working at a construction site outside Brighton. She used to come there to paint by the river. Always barefoot, hair in ribbons. God, Margaret, she was wild. She was light. We'd talk for hours about everything, music, books, the kind of future we thought we'd have." He smiled faintly, lost in a place I couldn't follow. "I asked her to marry me. She said yes. And then she disappeared." I sat motionless, my fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Disappeared?" "One morning, she was gone. No note, no message, nothing. I went to the boarding house where she lived. They said she'd packed up and left the night before. I looked for her for months, but she vanished. I thought she'd changed her mind." "And you just moved on?" He hesitated. "Eventually, yes. And then I met you. You reminded me of her, but gentler, quieter. You laughed the same way she did. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself I was ready to love again." My heart sank. "You didn't even know she was my sister." "I didn't," he said quickly. "Not until I saw that photograph on your parents' mantelpiece. The one of you as a girl, standing with your mother and father. Rose was in that same picture. Same face, same smile. My mind refused to believe it. I convinced myself it was just a resemblance." "And then?" I whispered. Exhaled shakily. "Then I couldn't bear to lose you, too. You were my chance to start again. I told myself the past didn't matter, that the universe was cruel, but maybe it was giving me another chance at happiness." I covered my mouth, the horror of it seeping through my veins. "You married me, while still haunted by her." He met my eyes. I married you because I loved you. Don't doubt that. But a part of me—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "A part of me never stopped wondering why she left." I rose to my feet, the tears spilling freely now. "And now I know. She didn't leave you, Richard. She ran from you." He blinked. "What?" "She was my sister," I said, my voice trembling but sharp. "She must have realized somehow, maybe through someone, that you'd met me later. Maybe she found out and couldn't bear it. And when she died, you let her memory rot in silence because you couldn't face the truth. You built your second family, your lies, everything on top of Graves." He shook his head weakly. "You don't understand. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought if I stayed quiet, we could both have peace." "Peace?" I shouted. "You've destroyed peace for everyone. Rose died without knowing I was alive. I lived without knowing she existed. And you spent your life pretending this was love." He looked at me, his eyes red. "I did love you. I still do." But I didn't believe him anymore. Not because love wasn't real, but because his love had too many ghosts inside it. He reached out, but I stepped back. The photograph slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor between us. "You loved my sister. You lied to me for 40 years. You cheated. And now you want me to forgive you?" He didn't answer. He just sat there, his head in his hands, weeping quietly. The kind of weeping that comes from a man who's finally out of lies. I turned away. I couldn't stand to look at him. I picked up the box of letters and went to the bedroom. I locked the door and sat on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had never been mine. All night I read Rose's letters. She wrote about her dreams, about a man who promised forever. And then, later, the letters changed. She wrote about fear, about leaving, about someone watching her. The last letter was unfinished. Only one line stood out. "If he finds me again, I'll tell him the truth about the child." The child. My hands trembled so hard I almost tore the page. The words blurred as I whispered them again. The child. Richard never mentioned a child. The next morning, I confronted him. He looked broken, sitting at the table like a man awaiting his sentence. I placed the letter in front of him. "What child, Richard?" He stared at the page for a long time. Then he said softly, "I don't know." "Don't lie to me." He looked up, eyes bloodshot, voice trembling. "I swear, Margaret, when she left, I didn't know she was pregnant." I found out years later. A friend told me she'd given birth to a baby girl in a convent hospital. But I couldn't find her. I tried. I felt the world spinning again, cruel and relentless. A baby girl. "Yes," he said. "I searched everywhere, but the records were sealed. I thought she might have been adopted." Something inside me cracked wide open. The image of that young woman who had called him Leela flashed in my mind. The way her eyes looked familiar, the way she said, "Dad." It couldn't be. I sat down slowly, every breath heavy with disbelief. "Richard," I said quietly, "Leela might not just be your mistress. She might be your daughter." He looked at me like he hadn't understood the words. "What?" "Think," I said, my voice trembling. "If Rose had a child and she disappeared and you never found her, and then years later you met a young woman named Leela who looked just like Rose did, don't you see it?" He shook his head violently. No, that's impossible." "But I saw it. the terror creeping up his face, the dawning realization that the sin he carried might be darker than even betrayal. "Richard," I whispered, "what if you've been living with your own daughter all these years?" He pushed back the chair and stumbled away from the table, one hand gripping his chest. "No," he gasped. "No, God, no!" The cup on the table tipped, spilling cold tea across Rose's letters, turning her ink into rivers. I rushed to him, grabbing his shoulders. "Tell me, Richard, did she ever show you a birth certificate, a name, anything?" He couldn't answer. His breathing turned ragged. He clutched his chest again, wheezing. His face turned ashen. "Richard!" I screamed, holding him upright as he collapsed to his knees. His eyes rolled back, his hand still pressed to his heart. And then, just before he went still, he whispered one word that chilled me to the bone. "Daughter." I held him as the life left his body, the box of letters beside us, the photograph of Rose staring from the table as though watching her story finally claim its end. But I was wrong. It wasn't the end. Because 3 days later, when the police came to question me about the incident, one of them handed me a file they'd found in his car. Inside was a DNA report, dated a year ago. The result said, Subject A, Richard Whitlow, Subject B, Leela Moore, probability of parentage, 0%. So if she wasn't his daughter, then who was she? The police left that evening after hours of quiet questions. They spoke softly, respectfully, as if the air in the house was made of thin glass. When the door finally closed behind them, I was alone again. Alone with the echo of a life that no longer made sense. I sat in the living room, holding the DNA report under the lamplight. The paper shook in my hands. I read the same line over and over again, hoping it would change. Probability of parentage, 0%. So she wasn't his daughter. Not by blood, not by any test. Then what was she? I thought about everything. The calls, the blue shuttered house, the children who called him dad, the letter, Rose, the baby. Every thread tangled into the same knot. I needed answers, and there was only one person left who could give them to me. The next morning I drove to that house again. The sky was gray, clouds hanging heavy and low. When I reached the blue shutters, something felt wrong. Too quiet. No sound of children, no sign of movement. I knocked, once, twice. Then the door opened a crack. It was the young boy again, his eyes swollen from crying. "Mom's gone," he said simply. The words sank into me like a blade. "Gone?" He nodded. "They took her to the hospital 2 nights ago. She didn't come back." I went inside without asking. The air smelled like candle wax and medicine. On the kitchen table lay a folded piece of paper with my name on it. Margaret. The handwriting was weak, shaky, but still graceful. I knew it was hers. I unfolded it slowly. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then I have already left. I wanted to tell you one last truth before I go. I am not Richard's daughter, and I am not just a stranger in your story. The truth is buried in the hospital where I was born, St. Mary's Convent. I found it 2 years ago when I became sick. My birth certificate had 2 names crossed out. One of them was your mother's. She tried to claim me when I was a baby. The nuns said no. They said I'd already been registered under another woman's name, Rose Whitlow. I don't know what that means. I don't know who I really am. But if you want the truth, go there. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know who he was when I met him. Lila." The paper slipped from my hand. I leaned on the table, my legs trembling. My mother's name. Rose's name. The convent. It was as if fate was pulling me back to the beginning of everything, to the moment two babies were separated and every lie began. I left the children with the neighbor and drove straight to St. Mary's Convent. It was an old stone building, half hospital, half chapel, standing like a monument to forgotten sins. The nuns moved through the corridors in silence, their faces kind but distant. I approached the reception and showed them the letter. "I need to see the birth records," I said. My voice cracked. "From 1963. The young sister looked at me with pity. "Those records are sealed, ma'am." I placed the letter on the counter. "Please," I whispered. "One of those children was me, and the other was my sister." Something in my voice must have moved her. She nodded slightly and disappeared into the back room. I waited. Minutes, hours, I couldn't tell. Finally, an older nun appeared, her face soft and lined with age. She carried a small file in her hands, tied with a faded blue ribbon. "We don't usually open these," she said gently. "But I was here in 1963. I remember the day." My breath caught. "You do?" She nodded. "Twins. Born too early, one frail, one strong. The mother couldn't afford both. We kept one. The smaller one was given to her family." "That was me," I said. The nun opened the file. "The other was registered as Rose, but there's more." She flipped a page and frowned. "After a few weeks, there was confusion. Another baby girl was brought in around the same time, abandoned at the church steps. The papers got mixed. We didn't realize until much later. The orphaned baby was recorded under Rose's name, and the real Rose was adopted by another family." I felt the room tilt. "What are you saying?" The nun looked at me with sorrowful eyes. "I'm saying that the woman you knew as Rose may not have been your twin at all." My knees weakened. "Then who was she?" The nun hesitated. "She grew up believing she was Rose Whitlow. She came back years later, pregnant, desperate, asking about her mother. We told her there was no record. She broke down and left." My voice was barely a whisper. "And the baby she had?" The nun looked down. "Left here, at this very convent." I stared at her. "That baby was Lila." She nodded slowly. "Yes, and according to the files, her mother used the name Rose Whitlow, though we now know she wasn't truly the same Rose from your family. She was the abandoned child who took her name by mistake." My mind spun. So the woman Richard loved, the woman I thought was my sister, wasn't Rose at all. And Lila wasn't his daughter, nor mine. She was the daughter of a stranger who had borrowed my sister's identity. I couldn't breathe. All those years of grief, betrayal, and guilt, all of it born from a name that never truly belonged to anyone. The nun handed me the papers gently. "Sometimes," she said softly, "God lets the truth stay tangled because he knows we couldn't bear it all at once." I walked out of that convent with shaking hands, the file pressed to my chest. The wind outside was sharp and cold. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the crucifix above the roof, thinking about everything that had been lost, and how none of it could ever be reclaimed. That night, I buried Richard. The rain poured down like it was trying to cleanse the earth of secrets. Only our children stood beside me, unaware of the labyrinth their father had built around us. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just watched the casket disappear into the soil and thought, maybe truth is just another form of grief. When I got home, I opened the box of letters one last time. I found a small folded note tucked between Rose's pages, or rather, the woman who believed she was Rose. It was written in the same hand as the others, but this one wasn't to Richard. It was to her daughter. My dearest Lila, if you ever find this, know that I never meant to hurt anyone. I only wanted to give you a life better than mine. I don't know who I am anymore, but I know who you are. You are my truth. I pressed the note to my chest, tears falling freely. In the end, it didn't matter whose blood ran in whose veins. What mattered was that love, in all its flawed, twisted, human ways, still managed to survive. But as I turned to leave the room, the light caught something I hadn't noticed before. Carved faintly inside the lid of the wooden box. 3 initials, R.W. And beneath them, another line etched by hand, shaky and faint. Forgive me, Margaret. She was never meant to find out. I ran my fingers over the engraving, my heart pounding. My husband had known everything. The switch, the lie, the truth behind Rose and Lila, long before I ever did. I sank into the chair, clutching the box. The storm outside roared, and I whispered into the dark, "Then why, Richard? Why did you let me live a lie all these years?" The house didn't answer, but somewhere, deep inside, I felt it. That final truth was still waiting to be found. And I knew I wasn't done yet. For days after the funeral, the house seemed to breathe differently, like every wall was exhaling secrets it had held too long. I kept hearing Richard's voice in the corners, soft, apologetic, unfinished. Every object carried a memory that didn't belong to the man I thought I knew. I couldn't rest, not after what I'd found carved inside that box. She was never meant to find out. The words spun around in my head like a clock with no hands. What else had he hidden? What more could there be after 40 years of lies? I started going through everything again. Every drawer, every folder, every scrap of paper he'd ever touched. Most of it was ordinary. Bills, bank statements, birthday cards. But then I found a small envelope tucked behind a loose panel in the wardrobe. It was addressed to me, but the seal was unbroken. My heart pounded as I tore it open. Inside was a letter in Richard's handwriting, shaky but familiar, written not long before his death. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, I am gone. I wanted to tell you the truth before the end, but I didn't have the courage. You deserve more than silence. You were never the only one deceived. I was too. The woman you knew as Rose, she wasn't the same Rose I once loved. She sought me out years after we'd lost touch, claimed she had been my Rose, and I believed her. She looked like her, sounded like her, even remembered things only we knew. I thought it was a miracle, that fate had given me a second chance. But months later, I began to doubt her. Small details didn't fit. Her handwriting was different. Her stories changed. I confronted her, but she cried and said she'd been sick, that her memory wasn't what it used to be. And I, fool that I was, chose to believe her again. By the time I discovered the truth, it was too late. She had given birth to Lila. I had a DNA test done when I suspected. Lila wasn't mine. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy their lives. They needed me. So I became what they thought I was, a husband, a father, a man of 2 homes. I stayed with you because I loved you, Margaret. Not the fantasy of you. You. You were my anchor, my forgiveness, my peace. I wanted to protect you from all this, even if it meant dying a coward. Forgive me. Please. Richard. I read it 3 times. Each time, my tears blurred the words more. All the anger I'd carried began to unravel, thread by thread, leaving only an exhausted ache. He had been deceived too, manipulated by a woman wearing another's name. I thought about the way Lila had cried when she spoke about not knowing who she truly was, the way she clung to hope even as her body failed her. Maybe we were all victims of the same lie, just caught in different corners of it. That night, I drove to the hospital. I needed to see her, to tell her what I'd found, to end this cycle of half-truths and ghosts once and for all. When I reached her room, the nurse looked up with pity in her eyes. "She passed this morning," she said quietly. "But she left something for you." She handed me a sealed envelope. On it was written, "For Margaret, the last piece." I sat down in the hallway and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a short letter and a photograph. "Margaret, I found this among my mother's things before I went to the hospital. I think it belongs to you. I didn't understand it until now. Please know, I never wanted to hurt you. If I had known who I was, or who you were, I would have done everything differently. But sometimes we live other people's lives without realizing we were born into their stories. Thank you for coming when I called. Thank you for listening. Lila." The photograph was old, sepia-toned, creased down the middle. It showed a young woman holding a newborn baby, standing beside a nun. The woman's face, it wasn't Rose's. It wasn't mine either, but her eyes, those were Lila's. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, was written, "To Sister Agnes, thank you for helping me find her again. Her name is Margaret." I felt my chest tighten. I flipped the photo over again, tracing the outline of the baby's face, the shape of the woman's jaw. A horrible realization crawled up my spine. The nun had said 2 babies were mixed up at birth. One had been given away under the wrong name. One had been raised by mistake. That meant the woman in the photo, Lila's mother, had been looking for her Margaret, not me. The truth came in a flood that left me trembling. I wasn't the real Margaret Whitlow at all. The mother in the photo had been the true Margaret's mother, the woman who'd returned to reclaim her baby, only to be handed the wrong one. Me. I stared at my hands, suddenly unsure whose blood ran in my veins, whose face I'd worn all my life. My parents, my sister, my husband, all of it, every piece of my identity, had been built on a mistake made by strangers trying to do what was right. For a long time, I couldn't move. Then, quietly, I began to laugh through the tears. Because what else was left? Life had tricked me, yes, but it had also given me a story no one could have written on purpose. In the weeks that followed, I arranged Lila's burial beside her mother. I made sure her children were cared for, placed in good hands. I sold the blue-shuttered house and donated the money to St. Mary's Convent, asking them to restore their records, to keep no more secrets in the name of mercy. And then I went home to my empty house, to the quiet that finally felt like my own. Sometimes I still sit by the window where all this began, watching the world fade into evening. I think about Richard, not with anger anymore, but with a soft, resigned sorrow. He was a man who tried to mend the past with lies because truth terrified him. Maybe I would have done the same. I think about Lila, too. the child of no one, yet loved by everyone she met. Maybe she was the bridge between all our mistakes, the fragile proof that even lies can create love if they last long enough. On my desk sits the photograph, the woman, the baby, the nun. I keep it framed now, not because I need to remember who I was, but because it reminds me that identity is a fragile thing, borrowed from stories we never chose. I've stopped asking who I really am. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that, in the end, I found peace where there used to be pain. And sometimes, when the wind rattles the windows late at night, I swear I can hear Rose's laughter, the laughter of the woman I once believed was my sister. Maybe she's somewhere peaceful now, with Leela and Richard, watching me untangle what they could not. I close my eyes and whisper into the silence, I forgive you. All of you. Then I add, softly, for myself, and I forgive me, too. The clock ticks, the house sighs, and for the first time in 40 years, I feel truly, completely free.